Well, it's a joy and privilege to have Jonathan Leeman on the podcast. Jonathan is the editorial director for 9 Marks, co-host of Pastor Talk podcast. He's the author or editor of over a dozen books, and he teaches at several seminaries. He lives with his wife and 4 daughters in a suburb of D.C., Washington, D.C., and is an elder of Cheverly Baptist Church. So welcome, Jonathan. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Chap. Thanks for taking an interest in the book.
Yeah, well, I read that introduction from the book Authority, and I'm gonna read the subtitle. That's quite a mouthful.
I have to do the same thing.
How godly rule protects the vulnerable, strengthens community, and promotes human flourishing. And so this is, I just think this is a profound subject that families need to understand, be comfortable exercising authority. And then also there's this, since you are doing a comprehensive view, you're talking about churches and governments and business as well. So
Yeah.
before we get into the book, just do you mind telling us just a little bit about your family as well? Because obviously a lot of the audience here is families, parents, grandparents.
Sure, of course. Grew up in a Christian home, had Christian grandparents on both sides. Very grateful for parents and grandparents, and my ability to write on this topic depends in part on the fact that I think by God's grace, I've been under very good authorities. I'm married to Shannon. We have 4 daughters. They range, well, they're 17, 16, 14, and 10. The 4 girls are. And
Great.
all of them are wonderful, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful for them. People are like, what are your hobbies? And my hobbies are like hanging out with them, doing stuff with them.
That's great.
So,
That's great. Yeah, that shows you have connected to their heart, that they still want to hang out with you. So good for you.
I
Well,
hope
let's
so.
talk about, let's just start by take the question for every author, really. Why did you write this book? What need do you see that caused you to put in the time and effort to write the book?
Yeah, sure. Several reasons. Number one, it's a crucial matter in Scripture and to the very way God has created us. Think about the dominion mandate itself. The very first verses of humanity in the Bible, God says, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion." Authority goes right to the heart of your existence and mine. So, one, for those theological realities. Number two, because it is such a contested issue in our day, especially. Humans have fought against authority ever since Genesis 3. Nonetheless, I think there are cultures and places and times where that fight is worse than others. And ever since the Enlightenment, that fight against authority has gained a kind of philosophical legitimacy. And in our own day, speeding up to 2023 and so forth, it undergirds all of our culture wars. It undergirds all the conversations about gender, politics, church, trusting pastors, and abuse, and identity politics, and on we could go. So it's a hot topic, an important topic right now, and I think it's crucial that we understand it rightly, both its good bits and its bad bits.
Well, so let's dive into that. What is authority? And then what is good and bad authority? Or maybe we just start with what is authority, and why is bad authority so damaging in the
Yeah,
in
sure.
the church and home?
Well, to answer as concisely as possible, authority is the moral license people have to exercise power. Power is different than authority. Power is the ability to do something. I have the power to pick up a rock. I have the competence to, complete a math problem or fix a leaky faucet. Authority is the moral license to exercise that power. So when my daughter was 15, she had the power to drive a car, but she didn't have the authority to, not until she turned 16 and went to the Maryland Department of Motor Vehicles and they gave her a license. Okay, that license was authority to drive on a public road. And authority always requires a granting agent. It requires an authorizer. Somebody has to say, you have the authority to do X, Y, and Z, but not A, B, and C, whatever the case is. So that's what authority is. Authority is dangerous because ever since the fall, we have self-authorized. So evil one says, Did he really say? Don't you know that if you partake of it, taste of it, you will be like God? What does it mean to be like God? In that instance, it means to decide the rules yourself, decide the job that you have to do yourself, be your own authorizer, right? And when we authorize ourselves like that and defy God's law, we end up using authority to use, abuse, oppress, exploit, hurt, kill, eat up. And that's dehumanizing for us, the person in authority, and it's dehumanizing to those over whom we rule, right? We're using it for our gaining glory, not God's gaining glory, and not treating people as God imagers when we do that. And so many of the recent books on this topic, go back to your first question, why this book right now? Well, because so many of the good books on authority right now, Christian books, are all about the badness of bad authority. And we have to keep one eye on the badness of bad authority. That's important. So I'm grateful for those books. The problem is the solution to bad authority is not no authority, critique, critique, critique. The solution to bad authority is good authority. But what is good authority? So that's another conversation we have to have.
Well, that's really helpful. So, I mean, I think you're you're differentiating between power and authority. So I may step out in the middle of the road and stop traffic. So in that moment, I am exercising power,
Yeah,
but I don't have
exactly.
the authority to do that. And
Of course not.
a policeman does have that authority. And what you're also saying is when he rightly exercises that, that's great. When he doesn't, also, if he's exercising it poorly or if he's on the sidelines, passive, then we also have an authority, someone who should be ruling over a certain area who's actually not doing it well. And I appreciate your emphasis as I was reading through the book and thought, yes, this whole idea of rule. I've got a couple of blog posts on that. Just this idea that it starts in Genesis and God is actually training us, I would say, arguing that in our stewardship, we're going to be ruling forever. And so that's part of
Yes.
that's part of uh, managing your household well. We are growing into becoming better managers, better rulers for eternity. So that's great.
Well,
Well,
that's what
what?
good authority
Right.
does. Good authority is working to raise others up into oneself. So you're saying to your children, I want you to rule like I rule. So I'm going to give you little opportunities, little chances at exercising authority. And as you prove responsible, I'm going to give you more and more because that's the goal. My goal isn't just to oppress and abuse you however I want. My goal is to raise you up and give you life and opportunity and growth and power and strength so that you can do as I do. And isn't that exactly what God does with us? Well, he intended to do with us in creation, and what he's completing his work of doing in redemption.
Yeah, that's great. Well, talk. We just got into it a little bit. You talk about 5 principles of good authority. So why don't we just walk through those, and we'll have little sidebars off and think about
Yeah,
specifically how they apply in the home, and then of course we've got pastors listening, but thinking about the church as well. But how does good authority work?
yeah, sure. Number one, I say, and you might have to remind me, chap. I don't have the book right in front of me.
It's not unaccountable, but submits to higher authority.
Good authority is always under authority, always, for everybody except God, right? For humans, good authority is always under authority. Um, so, for instance, when our church or when the elders of my church are considering new elders, and we have, say, a man come in and sit in on an elders meeting, one of the questions we'll ask him is, are you willing to submit to the other elders? Don't make a man an elder or a pastor, even a senior pastor, if he's not willing to submit to the other pastors or the congregation as a whole. I don't trust a man to lead who doesn't know how to follow. We learn to lead by following, right? In the same way, the Son of Man himself came and only did what the Father told him to do, or say only what the Father told him to say. he put himself under the incarnate Son put himself under the Father's authority entirely, and so won all authority in heaven and on earth. And one philosopher puts it like this. He says, to be in authority is to be under authority, and to be under authority is to be in authority. And that's right. It says, I put myself under your authority and obey your rules and do what you say is right. And I'm learning from you and being trained in all of that I am, as it were, exercising and beginning to exercise your own rules, so that when the time comes, you can say to me, I'm going to step away and I'm going to trust that you're going to keep doing the same thing. That's how that works. Here's one illustration I read about of this in the home. A pastor called me not long ago and asked my opinion on a matter, which was a mother had slammed her 13, 14-year-old daughter into a fireplace. The 13, 14-year-old daughter was giving lip, being insolent, and in a kind of a fit of rage, this mother just kind of put her hands on her shoulders and pushed her into the, kind of the brick backdrop of the fireplace. And the girl got scared, ran out of the house, ran to a church member's house. They called the pastors. The pastors, at some point, and then the pastors called me and said, what do we do? And the girl was fine, but she was a little shaken up and traumatized from the experience. And me and the pastor talked about a number of things. What do you call CPS? What do you say to the parents? These kinds of things. The one thing I said, crucial for this conversation right now, is what that mother needs to understand is she doesn't need to just apologize to this daughter for that act of violence. She also needs to let her daughter see her, the mom, submitting to the authorities placed over her. Pastors, CPS, if that's what they decided to do. That daughter is only going to learn to trust her mother again and her mother's authority in her life as she sees mom submitting to those whom God has placed over her. And I think that's true of everyone, even the president. We all have authorities over us on this earth.
That's really good. So even you're saying a husband, several different aspects. So everyone needs to be submitting to authority. So a husband, even as he exercises authority in the home, the wife should be able to trust he is under the authority of the elders.
Absolutely.
And then kids, as we're calling them to respect us and obey, we're also talking about where it's not like we're the dictators and can do whatever we want. We also, parents are under authority as well. So that's
well. So I told you my daughters are teenagers, and we're talking about what kind of men they want to marry. And I said to them multiple times, girls, you do not want to marry a guy who will not submit himself to other men. He is not safe. If he's living in the dark and will not submit himself to other men, bring his own sins and struggles into the light, that is not a man you want to marry. So, whereas opposed to, a man who's like, look, I sin, I make mistakes, but then I bring those things into light and I submit them to other close friends and elders God has placed over me. Okay, that's a man who is going to sin, but you can trust him.
That's interesting. I'm thinking, I have a blog post, protection, not secrecy, saying for wives, you owe him protection, but you do not owe him secrecy. Meaning,
yeah,
I don't go around gossiping about all of our problems, but if there's a family secret, there are other authorities that I can go to.
Well, I was given a good example by this by my former pastor, Mark Dever. He would say to his wife early in the marriage, sweetheart, it's going to be tough being married to me. So you have my complete freedom to talk to other women and the pastors as you need to. You got to pass for me. Don't sweat it. So cool. I appreciate really cool.
it. Let's move on. It doesn't steal life, but it creates it. It's not unteachable, but seeks wisdom.
Yeah.
Any comments on those, thinking about parents?
Yeah, sure. Well, that second one, it doesn't steal a life, but creates it in many ways. If there's two things I want people taking away from the book, it's the first thing I said, good authority is under authority. And it's the second thing. It doesn't steal life, but creates it. In other words, I think every listener to this podcast to stop and think about all the different places in life the Lord has given you authority. In the home, in the workplace. Are you in the military? Are you a police officer in government? Now ask yourself, why do you have that authority? What is the purpose God has given you authority there? Pilot of an airplane. He's given you authority to create, grow, strengthen, build up, be a platform for others, right? I'm not, we don't have the authority we have to get so much as we have it to give and provide for others. I remember um, running around Disney World once with uh, one daughter on this shoulder and another daughter on this shoulder, and a third kind of trying to hold her hand. Why? Because we had to get to the princesses. The stupid these ladies in costume. My little girls were dying to see the princesses. And so I'm out there in the Florida sun, sweating like a pig, carrying because we were trying to get there by a certain time or something. Like carrying, and your neck's cramping up and your back's hurting, and you're doing all you can to help your your daughter see the princesses. And I remember my wife caught a photo of me, and I looked at the photo. I remember thinking, that's I think by God's grace a little bit like God, insofar as He makes Himself a rock that we stand on. In other words, good authority isn't just top down, me telling you what you must do. It's also bottom up sometimes. In that God, as I said, is a rock. He gives us a place to stand. He tries to strengthen us. He gives us an opportunity to grow and to work. He supplies us. Hey, any tree in the garden you want to eat is fine. All these all these bushes, eat them. Not that one, but the rest of them, they're yours. I'm trying to resource you. I'm here for you. Yeah, so that's what are you trying to do in your kids' lives? You're trying to teach them to run faster, think better, know more, love God, worship, you know? So we're seeking to create life, not take it.
I've heard you use the illustration and of a good teacher or a good coach, and you're exercising authority. Your classroom is not out of control, and you're very. My mom was an English teacher, pretty strict, I think. But the goal was that they would learn English, and just
Mhm.
had kids come back and say, "Oh, your class was my favorite class." So it's that. I think what I am the head of my household, but it is not for me so that I can sit on the couch and watch football. It is to cause, in your case, for young ladies to flourish and grow, or five young ladies.
Which is to say, the one in position of authority in some ways is working the hardest. It's like the principal whose car's in the parking lot before anybody else in the morning, and that car's the last one to pull out of the parking lot because the principal's just doing all she can to get everything done. It's like the pastor's the last to leave the church, sort of thing, or it's any number of parents staying up late. And so, husbands, I want to say, husbands, are you the hardest working one in your home? Are you helping with the dishes or whatever, the laundry? So that your wife can have rest when she needs it for her purposes. So yeah, keep
Oh,
going
that's
on
good.
with examples.
And yet that gets a little bit into the fifth one. So I think we've kind of covered this. Good authority is not self-protective, but bears the cost. But I want to go back to your fourth one. Is neither permissive nor authoritarian, but administers discipline. So I think that's an
Yeah.
interesting so interesting contrast there: permissive or authoritarian, but and then you got the qualifier as the phrase at the end, but administers discipline. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think people today are afraid, as parents today especially, are afraid of discipline, right? Just recently, a friend of mine, he and his 3-year-old and the three of us were kind of walking out from a driveway into a street, and the 3-year-old started to walk into the street, and she's a very smart 3-year-old, and she knows how to argue and so forth. And my friend, God bless him, just he said, "Don't do this." She did it anyway, and she proceeded, and she said, "Well, I'm going to do this, blah 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 blah," and he just says like, and let her go. And I'm just like, no, stepping into it. If you're gonna draw the line anywhere, friend, let her be on a street. That is life or death. You're not loving your daughter right now, you know, and you insist in this situation. And I think when we don't draw boundaries, don't draw lines, and don't discipline our children, what do? We're creating narcissists. We're saying, look, the world's going to conform to you and there's going to be no consequences to it. So you go ahead and live the way you want, whatever you want inside, that's fine. Nobody's going to check you, correct you, discipline you. Okay, well, I feel entitled to everything. I can do what I want. The world's here for me. I don't have to conform myself to various structures. If a boss says you need to be here on time, why do I need to be there on time? If he says, I need you to work harder and get these things done, well, boss, I don't know if you're respecting my space, so forth and whatnot, and my internal needs. So when we don't discipline our children, we are not loving our children. Right? That kind of permissiveness is not love. It is hate, in fact, says Proverbs. On the other hand, yes, it can go too far. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. And in that sense, I think every father and mother needs to know themselves and their tendencies. I tend to think almost by different temperaments, we tend to err in one direction or another. Are you type A, type B? Is it? For myself, honestly, I think I probably would err towards authoritarianism. I have a strong personality. I'm kind of independent, self-sufficient. I get it done. I expect you to get it done. And I'm going to say, here's the lie. I'm kind of a truth guy, right? So I'm a writer. And so for me personally, I'm having to kind of work against that tendency and sometimes take a risk in being a little more permissive. But the goal, of course, for me is kind of that balance. Now, on the other hand, you might be like this friend I was with, inclined towards a little more easygoing, which is good, but recognize those tendencies and practice setting some boundaries, offering some correction, doing some discipline. You love your child by doing that.
That's really helpful. I mean, I'm thinking, even back to the way we began this. So I am to rule well, and we want to train disciples who will rule well. And that ruling well starts with being willing to submit, being under a higher authority, having control of myself. I mean, we had when our kids were little, the magic word was freeze, and the freeze was like in your instance with your friend. Freeze was, do not question me, just freeze. There are plenty of other times where they could interact with us, but in that life-threatening street crossing, parking lot time, and that causes them to flourish. And when they don't obey, which we expect them not to, like you said, if we don't bring consequences, then then they're going to say, oh, there are no consequences in life. So this ties in a little bit with you use a very interesting term, and I want you to talk about it just for a little while. You talk about the office of parent. Now, that is not a phrase I think I've seen in any book.
Okay.
Congratulations, you have a baby, and now we're inducting you into the office of mother, the office of father. Talk about that.
That's right. Yeah, sure. What I'm trying to do there is help people understand that these authority structures operate inside of the different family functions God gives us, right? In the same way it does at work, right? At work, you have an office, you have certain responsibilities, certain duties, certain obligations by virtue of possessing this office. Or in the church, you understand, I'll say elders and office, obligations, duties, responsibilities, limits, accountability structures to this office. Okay, what do we mean when we say Michael is Cecilia's dad? Well, we mean, let me think. It means, he's her dad, right? That she came from him, yes. But we also have a number of moral claims that we're making at that moment. Certain obligations, duties, responsibilities, accountability structures that he and she now bear towards one another that Michael doesn't bear with, the kids down the street, the next house over. He has a set of divine duties and structures that God has established, right? That he is responsible to. And he can perform his job, office well, or he can perform it poorly. And so I just use that language to function as a kind of X-ray machine that exposes the skeletal structure of these duties and obligations and responsibilities inside of the flesh of my relationship with my daughter, or yours with your son, and so forth. Yeah, so that's what I'm getting at there.
Well, that's great. It's kind of bracing, but I think in a good way, to say, oh, Okay. Yeah, that's good to
Well,
remember.
I'm trying to draw things into the light.
Yeah. Well, think
But
about somewhat related, well, related to that, definitely. With authority, then we also should talk a little bit about submission in terms of, and your chapter title, Submission is the Path to Growth, Authority, and Likeness to God and Man. It never has absolutes, it always has limits. But if we're talking about the goodness of authority, can we talk a little bit about the goodness of submission? Because as we're training our children to obey us, so we have to submit, but we're also training our children in the goodness of submission.
yeah,
So just talk about submission there for a while as growth, and then
yeah, sure. In many ways, this chapter emerged from what I think was probably my conversion and how that all transpired. I grew up very much a nonconformist, oldest child, and not the obedient oldest child, but like the rebellious, you know, don't tell me what to do, oldest child. And if I was a Republican, or if I was in a room full of Republicans, I would argue like a Democrat. If I was in a room full of Democrats, I would argue like a Republican. That was just me in high school, college, early adulthood. And then I started attending a church where there was a kind of a very strong, strong, in a good sense, pastor who called me in a particular instance to submit. I won't get into all the details to what he was recommending the church do. And we had he didn't call me personally, he called us to vote in a particular direction for a particular motion he was making. And at first I didn't like what he was asking us to do. Yet through a series of conversations, I decided, okay, the best thing for me to do here is submit. He's the pastor God has brought into my life. I should submit. And God used that experience to grow me and to teach me and to start even drawing me into more leadership in the church. And I remember at one point having this kind of eureka moment where I realized, oh my goodness, submission's a good thing. Like, what? Yeah, submission actually grew me. How come we never talk about this? Obedience often, I think and even in, kind of a Sunday school mindset, construe as a necessary evil that you endure with for a time, but then you kind of can cast off the constraints of what you're called to obey. And yet I realized, oh no, this is how God has set the whole thing up. And this is what grows us into authority. Um, and as I said to you earlier in the conversation, yeah, it's the people who know how to follow we entrust with leadership. But even when you're leading, you're also submitting. So there's a sense in which authority and obedience very much are two sides of the same coin. If you're doing one well, you're doing the other as well. Well, always two sides of the same coin. Again, think of the Son of Man. Think of incarnate Jesus, right? And submission to the Father and exercising all authority in heaven and on earth. Now, as soon as we talk about submission, we absolutely have to talk about the limits of submission, because as you said a moment ago, chap, no authority on earth is absolute. Only God's authority is absolute. So we have to talk about the limits of submission. Still, before we even do that, I think it's crucial that evangelicals recover an understanding of the goodness of submission.
that's good. Do you want to just take a few sentences just and make sure we hit on it's never absolute? I'm thinking perhaps of the mother who is dealing with the unsaved husband, or is wants to follow the Lord. Just take a few minutes and
Yeah, sure.
talk
Right.
about, even though it does say, wives, submit to your husbands, what's
Uh-huh.
going on in this dynamic.
Yeah, sure. Well, the larger principle is only God's authority is absolute. Authority is not something we possess innately. It's an office. There's that word again. We step into that somebody has to give to us. Always. We never just grab it. It must be given to us. Um, and therefore, it always needs to be in a posture of submission. But the submission is never absolute, and that we're called to, and it has its limits, as I said. And the three limits I outline in the book, and it's say, a wife of a tough husband, or children of an abusive parent, or even an office. Limit number one: if they ask you to sin. I think people understand that. That's a pretty common thing to say. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel, Paul and John and Sanhedrin. Number two, when an authority when an authority figure, legitimate authority figures exercise that authority or ask for something outside of their jurisdiction that God has not authorized them to ask for. And there's a few examples I think we have of this in Scripture, like Saul says, anybody who eats before the end of the day, will be cursed or whatever. And Jonathan comes along and eats some honey. Saul didn't have the authority to do that. And that's why I don't think there's any consequences, legitimate consequences, or other examples I could give from Scripture. So for instance, do the Taliban have the authority to require women to wear burqas or full-headed, what do you call them, hijabs? Or does the government have the authority to require women to wear those things? I don't think so. And so if I'm in a situation with my wife in Afghanistan and daughters, and they can get away with not wearing it without consequences, I say, sure, don't. I don't think you're obligated to. So number two, outside of their jurisdiction, and just to kind of make that clear, to say otherwise, to say anyone, the government, anyone has comprehensive authority everywhere, even a parent everywhere, is to say, again, we're self-authorizing. No, we're not. We only have authority where God has given it. And then third, of course, I think the limit is the threat of harm. I think there is a right of self-defense. So if a duly established authority is acting in a way that would unjustly, wrongly harm me, father swings his fist, well, I think that kid should duck and run. Doesn't need to submit to that fist about to cross his face.
That's helpful. And I think there have been times, even as we were raising our kids, where a father's authority was so exalted that that he could basically cause harm. He was not submitting to others, and there was harm that people were experiencing. They were not flourishing. So that's very helpful, and that really brings us into a nuanced, again, I don't think I've ever heard this before, thought of this before, but you talk about the authority of counsel and the authority of command.
Yeah.
And you say that a husband and an elder has the authority of counsel, whereas a parent has the authority of command. So can you talk about how those are different and apply them at home?
Yeah. And those may not be the best terms, because people might say, okay, so your one has command and the other is just counsel. Well, no, it's not actually counsel. It really is an authority. And what both columns, and you kind of think of two buckets or two columns. In both columns, there is a real authority, which is to say the right to make commands, to say to you, you must. And you are then under obligation, morally, as it were, to submit, to say, okay, right? Because that's in both columns or both buckets. The difference between these two kinds of authority comes to the right of enforcement or discipline. An authority of command has the right to enforce that command through discipline. So think of the government as the power of the sword, or parents of young children, power of the rod, or even the whole church, power of the keys to excommunicate. That's that column. Okay, but over here in the authority of counsel column, there's no right to enforce through discipline. So think about a husband. Can you think of any verse in the Bible, any example, where husbands are given the right to discipline or like coerce their wives? Like, just kind of scan think through Old Testament, dude. Can you think of anything? I hope the answer to you're going to give me is no. You do not have the right to discipline or require something like that of your wife, the way you do with your 3-year-old. Okay, elders of a church. Again, same question. Now, I understand our Presbyterian and Anglican friends, I'm a Congregationalist, we'll disagree with this here. Okay, fine, we'll make some adjustments for that. But I'm making that claim. I'm making the claim that just as with husbands, so elders, pastors do not have an authority of command. They cannot enforce through discipline. Then go to the church and say, Joe has done this and you should remove him, but I can't invite you to my office as a pastor and say, you're out. I'm excommunicating you. The way, and again, some denominations like with bishops would say you can. I think that's right. And the reason this distinction, these two columns are absolutely critical to understand is it affects the way you exercise that authority. So when you have an authority of command, like a police officer, you can require decisions now. You need to slow down your car now. a sweetheart, a 3-year-old, you need to go to bed now. And yes, I will enforce it if you're not going to listen. It aims for immediate actions and immediate decisions, and it exercises itself accordingly. Whereas pastors and husbands, it's not about now. It's about seeking unity and Christ-likeness, unity, husband, Christ-likeness, elder, in the long run. And so I'm using my authority very patiently, very gently. I'm trying to win. I'm trying to woo, teach with great patience, Paul says to Timothy. Live with your wives in an understanding way, he says to husbands, right? And so I'm trying to win them as the husband, when my wife as a husband, as it were, kind of a Song of Solomon, power of attraction and love towards her. And as an elder, I'm trying to win the congregation with my integrity and uprightness and trustworthiness and my care and, my beloved, my joy and crown, says Paul. And I'm trying to win them to imitate me as I imitate Christ. And it's a long game. It's a slow thing. It doesn't force decisions. All that to say, yes, recognizing these two columns, these two different buckets, kinds of authority, dramatically should shape how you exercise that authority.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. There's just so much in there. Well, okay, so I want to ask you a question that I could not have asked you 10 years ago. How does authority of command become authority of counsel? How do you shepherd teenagers? Because you have a great quotation. I've included it in my upcoming book as well. It takes skill and wisdom to simultaneously lead people in the right direction while letting them figure out their direction on their own. I can't remember whether the context was family, but I'm like, that's parenting teenagers right there, and
That's so
20-year-olds, and just influencing them. So, yeah, just thinking personally, how have you exercised that transition over time? I mean, isn't that would you say that's part of the dance of a parent? Am I going to command? Is this something I'm going to command my
100%.
15-year-old?
Yeah. Moving 3 to 13 to 23, you are moving from command to counsel. Absolutely. Precisely what you're doing. And frankly, even beyond that, I don't know if my 30-year-old child will be required to submit to me in the same way. But yeah, certainly when I move from 3 to 13, I'm not going to discipline in the same way.
Yeah.
I was coming home on a plane just 2 days ago with a daughter, and she wanted to watch a movie. And she's 17. And I thought it was a horror movie. And on a plane, I knew, truly bad things would be screened out. So that was my context. And I decided, okay, am I going to insist she not watch it? Or am I going to advise she not watch it? And I chose to advise. I said, sweetheart, I would encourage you not to watch that. I don't think it's wise. That's all I'm going to say, though. And then she watched it and thanked me for what I said because she didn't like it. And I was like, okay, that kind of worked out, actually. I didn't exercise a real heavy hand, and she saw my point. Or here's another. I'm sorry, you're going to say something?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Here's a silly illustration. Literally just yesterday, I was helping the 14-year-old edit a paper. And my wife, I'm a professional editor. So I go in and I start, I start to fix it. I was like, stop it. It's got to be her paper. I'm like, I know, but that'll take forever. This is so much easier. And my 14-year-old's like, no, let dad. And so then we played a little game. I'm like, so, sweetie, do you want the word consequently here? Yes. And didn't you want to put a comma there? Yes. Okay, but that tension right there is precisely what we're trying to do as parents. We're trying to get them to, and in the quote that you just read, I'm trying to help my daughter learn how to write sentences in ways that are compelling, energetic, clear. And I can go in and do it because that's my full-time job. But how do I help her do it and not just do it? And movement, again, from 3 to the 13 to 23 is all about making that adjustment. And, okay, here, can I give one more?
Absolutely.
Story. And their advice, an older man who one of my disciples, I would say, gave me. He said, when your kids are little, you're kind of out front of them. And he held his hands out like this. He said, you're out front and you're kind of pulling them along. But then when they get to the teenagers, you need to pull alongside them, kind of put his hands next to each other like this. And there you're starting to ask questions. You're reminding them of the principles that you believe and maybe they believe, and you're asking questions. Is this the wisest way to do that? And then as they move out of the teen years into their 20s, more and more, and they move to, the first hand behind the second hand, um, you're behind them, kind of cheering them on. And we need to make that movement. And my wife and I have discovered that as our daughters moved into the teen years, we had to help each other with that. Because when they're littles, it's easy to say, hey, sweetheart, go clean up. I asked you to clean that up. You need to clean that up. You just kind of give the command. And we had to remind one another that we need to ease up at times and invite them into things, have conversations with things. And, on different days and different situations, my wife would be better at, or I would be better at it, at making that transition. And the thing is also, we would frequently say to our kids, we'll give you as much freedom as you prove responsible with. If you don't prove responsible with it, we're going to retract it. We're going to, the playpen's going to get smaller. But if you're responsible, man, look at that playpen is, huge, big as you want it. But you gotta prove that you're internalizing the principles of wisdom that we've been trying to teach you.
That's really good. That brother was Matt Schmucker, right? That shared
Indeed,
that.
it was.
He was just up here preaching, and his podcast is the next one coming up. It'll be out
Okay, good.
before this one. I with his permission and posting that sermon, which was so good. I loved how you used insist and advise. And I have to say, as a dad, that was probably the perfect situation. So that the bad parts are out of the movie. You're sitting right beside her, and yeah, you part of this wisdom is letting people make their own mistakes and suddenly figure out,
that's right.
come to the conviction that my dad's pretty wise after all. So that was that was good. Well, I just thank you so much for our time. Let me just finish up with one last question here.
Yeah.
And I just, why don't you speak, or maybe two here, but ending our time, speak to the young mom or dad who's afraid to rule, to give clear commands or consequences. We may have already covered this, but I just want to encourage in this day, I say to parents, it's authority and affection, and to paint with a very broad brush, this generation is nailing the affection, but they're not nailing that authority. So how would you encourage the young parents who perhaps are letting their kids run wild and they don't see the well, even that's derogatory. They're giving them huge amounts of freedom, and not
too soon. Too much freedom too soon.
Too soon. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd say you're weakening your kids. You are not letting them reach their full potential. Think of it is one way to put it. A more aggressive way to put it is you're sowing the seeds of life decisions that are going to hurt them, destroy them. A city without walls, a man without discipline is like a city without walls. You're not teaching them to have self-discipline, because it's that correction and discipline which teaches us self-discipline as we internalize external discipline. That's the goal, to help them internalize external discipline. Or you think of scripture, Proverbs says, man who spares the rod hates his child. Well, that's what's going on there. Why hate your children? Well, again, because it's finally selfish to not discipline your kids. Ironically, you think you're being nice, you think you're being compassionate and loving, and maybe in a certain respect, your heart is those things. But in a considered sense, you're being selfish and lazy, because it is hard work, and it's hard work to do it well, right? It's easy to do it violently, angrily. That's not what we're talking about here. It's hard to do it slowly, compassionately, gently, calibrated to their little frames, calibrated to this one's sensitivities, and do it well. Yeah, it takes studying the child, right, and knowing the child, and knowing what's too much and what's not enough, and what is truly helpful to them. And so I think in some respects you're at risk of being lazy and unloving. And Proverbs says hating your child. Discipline is what a coach does to make the people run faster, to shoot the ball better, to dance a better dance. So the Lord disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. He is treating you as sons, it says. And he disciplines the one he loves. So do you love your children? I promise you, it will pay dividends. Not that you can guarantee your kid's going to be a Christian, but you can teach your kids the basic of sowing and reaping. And we don't have control over their regeneration, but we can teach them the sowing reaping principle and principles of wisdom in life.
It's really good. That's really good. I feel like today's in trying to be a gospel parent, we've forgotten that character training. So character training is important, as well as praying that God regenerates the heart, obviously. But we're still.
And when they fail, gospel. Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. Discipline and gospel, both.
Well, thank you for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really feel like this book, Authority by Jonathan Leeman, should be read and on the shelf of every pastor and thoughtful parent. So I highly I encourage you, and thank you, Jonathan, for that labor of love. It will help many.
Good. Thank you, Chapin. Thanks for the great questions, brother.
You've been listening to the Disciple Making Parent podcast. For more information about the book, The Disciple Making Parent, visit thedisciplemakingparent.com.